Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this roundtable for the Northeast Multimodal Transit Summit. My name is Vernice Miller Travis, and I'm Executive Vice President at Metropolitan Group, a social change agency, and I lead our environmental, social justice, and racial justice practice areas and have been a long time, more than 30-year practitioner in the field of environmental justice. And have been working with the Center on Latino Progress on the, on the integration of equity and justice considerations into the Transportation Climate Initiative, and am honored to be a part of this conversation with them today.
Welcome. My name is Karen Jenkins. I'm currently the managing principal for a consulting firm. We work primarily with nonprofit organizations here and abroad on board development, fundraising, and strategic planning, generally with smaller organizations. I'm briefly going to say that I spent 7 years living in Zambia, 7 best years of my life, and had a fantastic international career where I lived in Kenya for a year, Paris, London, each for a year, and then went on to run international programs across the country. At one point, I was president of a large study abroad organization that sent students to 14 countries. So after returning to New Haven, I've now specialized in working with nonprofits, primarily on fundraising. So do you want me to continue, or do you want the other panelists to introduce themselves?
I would like you to continue by saying, what is the name of the company that you lead?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's New Development. Sorry, that was the one in Zambia. Development for Good, LLC.
Excellent.
But thank you for asking.
Thank you, thank you. And Karen will be followed as a speaker by Kevin Alvarez. Kevin is the Director of Legislative Affairs for the City of New Haven. Kevin, can you give a bit more in-depth introduction of yourself, please?
Yes, absolutely. And it's good to be here with you all. I'm Kevin Alvarez. I'm Director of Legislative Affairs for the City of New Haven. My responsibility is chiefly in any regional, state, or federal policy and the broader policy goals of the mayor and his administration. Previously, I worked in the office of Congressman Joe Courtney. I was caseworker for housing and higher education in that office, and then served as a consultant to both legislative and statewide campaigns and to state legislators while they were trying to work on their legislative agendas. So I'm happy to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kevin. And finally, we will be joined by Dr. Austin Brown. Austin has recently changed positions since we started our planning and briefing for this panel. And so, Austin, will you give a bit more introduction of where you came from and where you are now?
Sure, very pleased, and thanks everybody for taking the time. I know it's kind of a rough hour getting into dinner time, so I hope that this discussion will be worth joining. I'm confident with the quality of my co-panelists it will be, although I can't vouch for my own contributions. I will do my best. My position right now is with the Domestic Climate Policy Office in the White House. Our job is to help coordinate the whole of government approach to fighting climate change within the administration. My role there is the Senior Director for Transportation Emissions, so trying to keep track of and coordinate all of our agency efforts around transportation as they relate to climate mitigation. So working very closely with our departments of transportation, energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and many other agencies on our whole suite of policies that we can bring to bear to reduce emissions, keeping in mind that this administration doesn't view climate as a purpose unto itself. We view it as a piece of our overall fight to make the world a better place. So we believe in climate solutions that also are equity improving, empowering, that improve justice, correct some of the injustices of the past, and also are economically empowering, create good high quality union jobs for people. It's not either or, it's not let's do one of those but not the others. It has to be all of those simultaneously. So really pleased to be here today to join this discussion.
Thank you so very much. So you can see we have pulled together, or I should say, the Center for Latino Progress has pulled together a stellar panel of folk to really dig into the conversation we had today. And so I want to start by providing some framing comments and say that when we were preparing for this panel, Karen shared a guidance that I think is really important. And I hope I've split the difference well, Karen, but Karen said that because we always talk about our community, meaning environmental justice communities, however you want to define them, disadvantaged communities, environmentally overburdened, et cetera, we always define that from a place of disadvantage and lacking of assets, and that we should really try to reframe and be careful about our language and speak from an asset-based formation. And I should say, Karen, that particularly resonated for me. I used to be a program officer at the Ford Foundation and the asset and community building part of the foundation. So asset framing is really important. But I hope as I frame the conversation that we will have created some balance in that. And so this is what we are trying to accomplish today. This is the roundtable on environmental justice and being heard, community members who've been trying to make their voices heard in the creation of an equitable process. So at this moment, from the time that we have been preparing for this panel until this very moment, 4:30 p.m. or 4:44 p.m. on November 22nd, 2021, a whole lot of stuff has happened on the policy front. The infrastructure bill has been passed by the House and the Senate. That's going to bring, how can I say this technically, a truckload of resources to support transportation and infrastructure. The Build Back Better bill and act has passed through the House of Representatives. We hope it'll pass through the Senate, and it'll be still something that we recognize because it brings so many of the ancillary pieces to the infrastructure bill to bear. But the landscape around transportation equity, transportation planning, historic inequities, climate mitigation, carbon reduction, all of those issues have now taken on even more prominence. And of course, environmental justice and equity remain central to that conversation. So at this very moment, we're faced with both tremendous challenges and tremendous opportunities to elevate the concerns of those who have been most adversely affected by past inequitable transportation planning and decision-making. And with the recent passage of that infrastructure bill, we have the opportunity to envision a different path forward, one where we can learn from past policies, practices, and decisions to create more equitable, transparent, just, and environmentally beneficial outcomes for everyone. And so I'm going to ask our panelists, each one who's going to speak for about 10 minutes, to help shape and frame from their perspective and the work that they do and the constituents that they spend the most time with, help and shape that perspective. And first, we're going to hear from Ms. Karen Jenkins, again, the principal of Development for Good, and who's going to share existing resource challenges and opportunities and strategies to grow community-based organizations. And for all of us who do this work, none of this would be possible if we don't have those partners on the ground and if they don't have the strength and the capacity to drive this agenda. So Karen, could you open us up, please?
Thank you so very much. So I also want to mention that I'm one of the founding members or board members for the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation, NHCAT, which is why I'm here. About 15 years ago, serendipitously, I got caught up by bicycles. I served as actually the founding chair and member for the New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition, which is a statewide advocacy organization. Then I hit the big time and I joined the board of the League of American Bicyclists, which for those of you who know was founded in 1880 and is the oldest bike advocacy organization in the world. And it was really thrilling to chair that national board. It also taught me a lot about issues of transportation, biking, walking, use of greater public transportation. And then when I moved back to New Haven about 4 years ago, I worked with a group of people to found the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation. So I work really at the grassroots level as we are looking, our focus right now has been on bike education. We do not charge for our classes. We believe everyone should learn to ride a bike safely. We don't care how much money you have. We also give free new helmets to everyone who needs one. And we work very hard to get into less well-served neighborhoods so that people become active advocates as well as good bike riders. So what I'm going to talk about is how you can raise money, how you begin to raise money, because it's a real challenge at the grassroots level. And I'm sorry I don't have the opportunity to get to know each of you. I'm going to make some assumptions that you're coming from relatively small organizations and that you may be in Connecticut. And if you're like most of us, you go on a bike ride and you think, oh, if only I could meet that hedge fund manager who's going to make that $100,000 contribution to keep your organization going. But even when I'm talking to nonprofits that are not related or involved in biking, walking, active transportation, I always start by saying no money, no mission. That if we don't have the resources, we can't effectively get our mission out and become successful. So I'm going to just go through some tips and pointers that I hope will be helpful to you as you think about raising money at the grassroots level. Number one, you need to create a fundraising plan. Okay, so we know that Christmas and Hanukkah are coming, but you wouldn't wait until Christmas Day arrives to unpack your tree or unpack the menorah. You wouldn't wait until then to get groceries and purchase gifts. So start by creating a calendar with all the dates and opportunities you have to raise money at the grassroots level. Could be small activities like selling COVID masks made by volunteers. One of the nonprofits I work with actually generated considerable money over the summer by selling COVID masks that their volunteers made. Or you might be doing a walkathon or a virtual fashion show. At any rate, you need to make sure that months ahead, you're listing onto your plan what every activity is you need to cover in order for your activity to be safe, be successful. So if, for instance, you were going to do a walkathon, you would need water and bananas to distribute along the route. Actually, you'd need a route. You'd need to pick your dates. And so you need to make sure that every item is accounted for on your fundraising calendar. And then you also need to have responsible parties. Who's going to take care of buying the bananas? Who's going to make sure that the route is marked? It sounds simple, but if you want your donors to come back, if you're going to do an event, you need to make sure that they have not only a safe activity, but that it's also fun. Most important is each task, as I said, should have a responsible party with due dates. Then everyone knows what needs to be done and when. Get your data in order. These days, we don't work without an online presence. So make sure your mailing list is accurate while you keep building it. If you're not using a customer relations management program or CRM, explore the options. It's a powerful tool that will allow you to track every person you come into contact with. For example, if you call one of the utility companies, that agent you talked to knows who the last agent was you spoke to, and you can't lie about what you talked about because they got a record of it. So you want to make sure that your customer relation management program will accurately track your donors. You need to understand the people on your mailing list and those who make donations. So for instance, the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, still does large paper mailings because its constituency of retired people may not be computer savvy. Other groups communicate almost exclusively online. I'm thinking of the Boys and Girls Club, for example. As Giving Tuesday is coming up, and I hope everyone knows that Tuesday after Thanksgiving is Giving Tuesday, and then organizations are running into the end of year campaign. Look at the messages you're receiving and see if you get some good ideas that you could use, if not this year, then certainly next year. Certainly virtual fundraising is growing and quickly over paper mailings, which are actually costly. It takes money to print the paper, mail the envelope, put the stamp on it. So people are using their phones for all kinds of purchases and to make donations. I'm amazed that I can get on Metro North from New Haven to go to New York. When I get on the train with my phone app, I can buy the ticket. Within seconds, my receipt comes up and the conductor scans my receipt. I don't have to stand on the line anymore. It's all done on my phone. Same with fundraising. If you haven't already done so, you need to call on the branch manager of the bank where your organization has its bank account. This sounds really simple, but you'd be surprised how many organizations overlook that. Most banks have a national foundation that supports a range of activities, but donations from the national organization usually require the endorsement or recommendation from the branch manager. And most branch managers have discretionary funds to make donations, usually ranging from $250 to $500 for local events that promote the bank at the grassroots level. Banks will sponsor walks for a cause, bike helmet giveaways, dinners, bike rodeos for children, a whole range of activities. And the local and national bank foundation want to be seen as doing good in their community. And your organization can be part of that effort. It's also true for grocery stores that might donate the bananas for your walkathon, and retailers like REI make local donations, and there's also a national foundation. You need to establish a relationship with your community foundation. And across the country, there are community foundations that serve donors as well as nonprofit organizations. Since most of you are from Connecticut, I'm briefly going to mention the community foundations in this area are the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, the Valley Community Foundation, and the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. There are others, so do a Google search for community foundations in your area, and then make some phone calls to make connections. All community foundations offer workshops on subjects from fundraising to operating in the time of COVID to managing your database. And if there are topics that your organization would benefit from, make a request. There are likely to be others seeking that same information, and these workshops are always free. For those in the New Haven area, I'm sure you're familiar with the Great Give, which is a 3-day fundraising extravaganza offered by the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven and the Valley Community Foundation. They do extensive outreach to donors, so people and organizations are prepared to give in early May. And the Great Give is an opportunity for large and small nonprofits to reach those donors. Both foundations I mentioned offer workshops to help you prepare and execute your plan. And if your organization does not have fundraising experience, I highly recommend the Great Give to provide you with the know-how to do peer-to-peer fundraising, match campaigns, and other creative ways to reach donors. Also, some of the foundations will offer assistance from consultants. So in your area, you might be able to get a consultant to come and help you get your fundraising plan organized, educate your board, or undertake strategic planning. One of the organizations I want to mention in Connecticut is Sustainable Connecticut, a real good shout out to them. It's another organization that if your proposal is accepted, and it generally has to be around the environment that you're looking to support, and bicycles qualify, proposals accepted by the Sustainable Connecticut Foundation are eligible for a dollar-for-dollar match. The support to nonprofit organizations before and during the fundraising campaigns is knowledgeable, prompt, and very user-friendly. Not to be overlooked, you need to prepare your board to make donations and to be effective fundraisers. You want your board to be a 100% giving board, meaning every person on the board has made a donation within each calendar year. And each member of the board should be prepared to assist with fundraising efforts. Not everyone can make a gift that reaches $100,000, but everybody should be able to make a stretch gift from $10 to $100. And each dollar donated by your board would be most gratefully and graciously received. For the walkathon we talked about earlier, maybe your board could pool their money and offer to make a match of every dollar raised up to the amount of the match. It's people like that. People like to know that their dollars are going to be matched by $1. So getting your board involved. We also know that everyone is not comfortable asking for money, but asking for money is not the only task related to fundraising. Thank you letters need to be sent within 48 hours of donations. So make sure you get a board member who can write, whose handwriting you can understand, and get them to help with your thank you letters. Everyone has a role to play in fundraising. No task is too small. Or a board member may be comfortable in establishing the relationship with the bank manager, and then someone else takes up the task of actually talking to the bank manager about the donation. What's important is that every board member is passionate about the mission of your organization and willing and eager to tell others. And the board member who says she does not like to raise money might be the one on the bike ride who runs into the hedge fund manager. You can't tell. Finally, diverse boards and diverse organizations make a difference, and they are really powerful. So I'm going to end with my little slogan, no money, no mission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Such great information. I hope people were taking notes. Kevin, we're going to move on to you and ask you to talk about what are the challenges and opportunities that local government sees at this moment, and what do you think the city of New Haven is prepared to do to meet this moment?
Absolutely. And so I think the challenges and opportunities of this moment are some of the things that you would expect, and some of them are ones that you would not. First, among any of our challenges related to trying to make a more equitable city, in making a better transportation system, in creating policies that are going to improve people's lives. The biggest challenge is always, for a city like New Haven, a financial one, which is not something that I think most people will be surprised by. New Haven is a very poor city in many respects. It also, for a state like Connecticut, where unlike most states, the overwhelming majority of our funding for local services, police, fire, schools, comes from local property taxes. And in a state where that's the case, in a city like New Haven, where 60% of our property is non-taxable, it makes it very, very hard for us to fund the services, certainly that our people deserve, but even basic services in general. And so that's the starting sort of frame with which we are constantly going to be strained. But the other challenge that we're facing right now is that for the first time, certainly in my lifetime and in many of my coworkers' lifetimes that have been doing this work much longer than I have, it's the first time that there has actually been resources available where the role of government in people's lives has shifted, where people during the pandemic really saw that government had a critical and important role to play in making their lives better, and in making sure that when there is this enormous hardship that we're all facing, that the government is responding to it in a way that takes care of people and responds to that challenge accordingly. And so when you see the infrastructure bill that was just passed, led by a president who we are very lucky to have at this moment, when you see the Build Back Better legislation that just passed through the House, those are political realities that were not possible for most of my lifetime, for most of the lifetime of people. Because there was, in my office, in the mayor's office, there is the few folks that work in the mayor's staff, and then there's a large room where it is filled with cubicles. And since I've worked there, since most of my coworkers have worked there, those cubicles have been completely empty, because for so long, local government has not been set up to play that role in people's lives like it should, where delivering services and delivering them effectively is what local government is set up to do. So much of the political rhetoric that government's the problem, or that government is horribly inefficient and can't deliver these things, that paradigm that lasted for so long, or helped define politics for a huge amount of time, is at least hopefully starting to shift. But in that shift, it's really straining resources at the local level, certainly at the state level, and at the federal level, when you have all of a sudden the Treasury Department has to issue checks for child tax credit every month. That's a huge amount of resources dedicated to something that they didn't previously have to do. And so one of the challenges now that we're facing is there's actually money to spend. And for a city that's never had to have the opportunity to actually spend money in the way that we should be on our residents, it's a real strain. And so you have those challenges. And at the same time, you want to take this moment for what it is, which is one of the only chances we'll get to really, really change and improve people's lives, improve our transportation system, and make things better for people across the board. And so you want to make sure that when you get these resources that you're really engaging with, because especially at the local level, the power that communities have when they come together, when there is a partnership between the community and the neighborhoods that are being affected by policies, and the local government that's responsible for administering these policies, the power that they have together is enormous. A couple of examples of how I've seen that played out in my current role just recently were, many people on this call might know, Union Station in the city of New Haven is the anchor of the New Haven to New York City line. It is I believe, the most traveled or busiest commuter rail line in the country. And it is the Union Station and the city of New Haven. The Union Station is owned by the state of Connecticut. It is leased to the city of New Haven to operate, and its 35-year lease, which was the last time that it had a lease with the city, was coming up. I believe it's over in 2022. And for nearly the last 20 years, the city and the state have been fighting each other. And they've been fighting each other because the state, for a very long time, wanted to build significantly more parking on, I always mess up the direction, but on the, say, east lot of the station, there is a large area where there's been a strain on the station for parking. And so the state wanted to build 1,000-space parking garage on the east lot of the station. And the community and the city partnered up and said, if we're going to put a lot of money into a development near our train station, we want it to be something that's, sure, it address the concerns of the strain on parking at the station, but don't just build a behemoth parking garage. Instead, let's build a commercial development where a multimodal transportation site can be constructed, where it's going to benefit the neighborhood, it's going to benefit the city through tax revenue, it's going to improve that area overall. And for 20 years, I think the first article I found on this fight was from when I was 5 years old. For 20 years, there was this struggle with the state about whether or not we were ever going to come to an agreement on compromising to get something that was actually going to suit the needs of the community. And it took so many people that have been around a lot longer than I have, that had been fighting for that cause, that in this past year, the city and the state of Connecticut, within the first few months of the new administration, agreed to a 55-year new lease on the station, a multimodal transportation center with a much smaller parking component to it, but commercial development on the east lot. And then on the west lot, a multimodal transportation site for buses, for bikes, for pedestrians to walk, to make it a much smarter development for the community, for the state. And that really was the work of people spending years on it and really standing their ground, and for a city and the community in that neighborhood to really work together to try to make that a reality. And another just quick example is recently there was a proposal to expand a municipal solid waste site that's over in a predominantly Black neighborhood of New Haven. Most people know so often when it comes to environmental things of environmental concern, they're usually situated in vulnerable communities. And it was the community that really packed a punch in pushing back on that. And we were ultimately successful after years of this fight. We're ultimately successful in getting that expansion stopped. And so the reason I cite those is because it is so essential to this moment and to the opportunity that we have in this point in time to build those bridges between community organizations, people that are living in the neighborhoods, and the city that is responsible for providing those services. And you're not always going to agree, and you're not always going to get along. There are going to be different organizations that have different perspectives on the way that a problem should be solved. But engaging in those conversations and listening to the different perspectives that people come to the table with, whether it's different people in a neighborhood, whether it's going and knocking on doors to talk to people about their concerns, it's having that engagement is absolutely vital to making sure that the policies that we pursue are informed by the needs of the community, experiences that I don't have, that people that grew up in the Hill neighborhood of New Haven might have that I don't, making sure that we're listening to different organizations, some that are advocating right now for new bike lane on a certain street, and others that are fighting against that because they want to preserve the parking on that street because it's already strained. So engaging in that dialogue and recognizing that sometimes it's going to be, you're going to have to really fight and discuss things and have that robust discussion. But ultimately it is the responsibility of the local government to take that information and to recognize the opportunity that you have and deliver on it for the residents that you represent. So I think I was close to my 10 minutes on that, but I'm happy to talk more about any part of that a little
Kevin,
later.
I have several questions about what you said, but we'll save it for the Q&A. But the one thing that really jumped out at me, are you saying that you're 25 years old? Is that what you're trying to say?
I'm 27 years old.
Oh my God. Okay. You are kind of amazing at 27 years old. We will come back to that. Dr. Austin Brown. Austin, can you tell us how the Biden-Harris administration is looking to come in and support both local government and community-based organizations in the many efforts that you all have underway? And if you could say a little bit about Justice 40 in your remarks. Thank you, Austin.
Absolutely. But first I want to figure out how to go back in time and tell my 27-year-old self to be as accomplished and successful as Mr. Alvarez. I think he was bumming around, not doing very much useful, but we'll try to make up for lost time, I guess. I'm very happy to. I'll say I did lose my voice a little bit over the weekend, so we'll see if it holds up for a full 10 minutes. And if not, then I'll hand it off and drink some water, and we'll come back when we get to the Q&A. But those are my favorite things to talk about, so I'll hope that my voice holds out. So I mentioned in my kind of intro kickoff that the administration's commitment is to this all of the above working whole of government, but also with many priorities, including equity and justice in all of our climate work. And I'll try to use some examples from the incipient implementation of our infrastructure law now that I think is an example for how we're planning to do that with a few of these programs that I'm incredibly excited about. But before we do that, I want to acknowledge that where we're starting is from a point of deep injustice. The past transportation investments we've made in this country have directly led to many of the problems that are present today in communities. That includes choices about where infrastructure is or is not built. We've seen communities that have been divided by highways. We've seen communities where their homes have been taken with the eminent domain process, and clearly those communities were in many cases chosen because they were communities of color, or lower income communities, or both. And those communities became the spots where the undesirable transportation infrastructure was put. And the legacy of those investments is right in front of us in many communities and cities across the United States. We also saw the opposite side of that coin, which is the choice of who gets quality transit. And in many of the cities that do have successful transit programs, we see that access to the quality transit is really profoundly divided and inequitable. And we're even seeing that with the kind of initial investments in clean transportation that we're seeing, where there have been several research papers in recent months that have shown that the early deployments of electric vehicle charging has been inequitable, and the access to those chargers is sharply divided along racial and income grounds. So we know that we have a huge hole to start to dig out of, and we're not going to make progress unless we at least start by acknowledging some of the legacy of transportation injustice that we're operating in, and identify ways to do things differently to begin to reverse that. We've also seen that in transportation and in other areas, race and income profoundly affect what neighborhoods bear the burden of pollution. We see that truck routes from ports and warehouses and other things tend to go through communities of color. They tend to go through lower income communities. And we know that they provide a out of scale pollution burden to those communities that results in very different health outcomes, very different loss of life. And that's a thing that we can't take, and we need to step up and repair as quickly as possible. And we think these transportation investments are one way to do that. It's certainly not the only one. We need top to bottom reform and the rethinking of the way we run our transportation investments to do so. But I do think that the dual investments of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then hopefully the Build Back Better Act together can be the biggest single investment that we've ever made as a country in trying to reverse these trends. So that's the opportunity right now. I'll talk a little bit about what's some of the programs that I'm most excited about in the infrastructure law. I can't cover all of it because it's a pretty significant piece of legislation. So I'll just go through 5 that I think are really exciting and talk a little bit about our implementation of them. So one thing to communicate is that the administration is ready to hit the ground running on all of these efforts. We've been planning for this investment since day one. We weren't ever sure we were going to get it, but we believed that with the collaboration of this president and the Congress working together on a bipartisan infrastructure bill, we would be able to get something big done. And that belief is paying off in that we have now had sort of months of pre-work to get ready to run these programs. Now, of course, that doesn't actually turn into the same thing as getting them going. So we have a long way to go on implementation for each of the programs in there. But we've really been getting ready for this since day one of the administration. And we're thinking about all of this as a huge opportunity that, as Kevin says, to show that the government can really be a driving force for good in people's lives, and that these investments can really matter. And we know that each of these programs that I'm going to talk about and more only deliver real impact and visible changes in people's lives when the rubber hits the road and we actually get this investment out there to help people and to really make a difference in their lives. Right now it's just a lot of ink on paper. And we have a long way to go and a lot of work to do to get those funds out there and make sure that the actual investments are made. So the five highlights I'm going to talk about transit funding. I'm going to talk about zero emission school buses. I'll talk about port infrastructure electrification, bike and pedestrian investments, and electric vehicle charging, which is one that we're getting going right now. And I'll just go through these briefly. We have some kind of like summary sheets that are helpful if people want to dig deeper into each of them. And then there's, as I said, many others that I won't have the chance to talk about today. So the piece of the transit, there's a huge investment in transit funding in this bill. I think we're tracking $39.5 billion over baseline for transit, which is the largest transit investment in American history, and will really empower agencies that have been cash strapped for many years or decades to be able to go and increase service. And we know that when you increase service, you then increase ridership and you get a positive feedback loop as you're able to give people the kind of quality of service that they expect out of their transit agencies. And then a piece I'm incredibly excited about is a major boost, about 10 times expansion of the low and no emission bus program, which has a long track record of delivering cleaner buses to communities and has been dramatically oversubscribed for years. And so we believe that this investment increase, at the same time as technology costs are dropping and agencies are getting more and more familiar with the benefits these buses bring to their communities, we think that those together can be transformative in terms of making zero emission buses the norm in cities rather than the exception, bringing cleaner air, better air quality, lower operating costs for agencies, and a nice, quiet, comfortable ride for both the drivers of the buses, who always say we here love them, and as well as riders on the buses.
Austin, excuse me for interrupting,
yeah,
but
please.
who sponsors that program, that zero emissions bus
That's
program?
the Department of Transportation, and that's
Federal
a great,
DOT?
yeah, so that's the Federal Transit Agency Administration in the Department
FTA.
of Transportation. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. And I'll try to be good about saying where each of these programs is going to live if it's a single answer. Thank you for the reminder. So staying on the bus trend, we also have a major investment in zero emission school buses. Schools are maybe the most, if you had to pick a most important place to improve air quality, it's around our kids. And this is going to be the biggest, by far biggest investment in zero emission school buses. We've really only seen a few school districts leading the way with state programs. This is going to be a multi-billion-dollar federal investment in that. One thing that I'll flag and then I'll come back to, and I talk about some of the cross-cutting investment in communities that we're looking to do, is that most school districts in the United States have no experience at all with an electric school bus fleet. And there is additional or different work that needs to be done associated with zero emission school buses, especially planning charging infrastructure and understanding how to integrate that by partnering with utilities and getting that in there. So we're really focused on both getting the money to those districts, but also making sure that we're providing them with the technical expertise and insights that they need in order to be able to execute that and get these buses out there and in use in their school districts on routes and serving kids. In terms of port infrastructure, so port communities often have some of the highest pollution burden, and we know that the communities around those ports are affected by the noise and the air pollution of the port activity. Of course, ports provide incredibly important transportation services for the economy. So to balance that out, there's a big investment in the bill or in the law as a piece of the port investment overall that will help bring clean port infrastructure. It's called the Port Infrastructure Development Program, also out of Department of Transportation. I should back up. I forgot my own rule that Bernice suggested. The school bus program is going to be run out of the Environmental Protection Agency. They have a lot of experience with similar programs under what's called their DERA program, their Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which is a generalized funding for replacing vehicles that have high pollution diesel. This is going to be a big expansion of that, looking at a focus on electric school buses. Back to port infrastructure, that'll be run out of the Department of Transportation. There's two big pieces that I'm incredibly excited about. One is that Port Infrastructure Deployment Program. That includes a lot of funding that can go to zero emission equipment at ports. So helping to reduce the emissions of things like hovercraft, the cargo handling equipment, and drayage trucks. And then there's a set aside of $400 million that's specifically for reducing truck emissions in port facilities. The trucks are a huge part of the pollution burden of a surrounding community, as those trucks come in and out all day. And we know that with the growing global economy, we're expecting to just see a continued increase in truck traffic. And so if we're able to reduce the emissions for that, that has an immediate and measurable effect on those communities around ports in terms of improving their air quality. And then electric vehicle charging. This makes a $7.5 billion investment in EV charging. $5 billion of that is through formula grants, again, run out of Department of Transportation through states, but we expect that will all go and much of it will be run through communities themselves. And then $2.5 billion in a competitive grant program. For context, I know these numbers kind of get hard to understand what this means. The organization Atlas Public Policy, which tracks investments in electric vehicles, they estimate that we've had, if you take all public funding for electric vehicle charging in the whole country, including state funding, funding for the VW settlement, all of the public investment, they estimate cumulatively it's been 2.6 billion. So we're looking at an investment over the next 5 years that's something like triple what we've put publicly into EV charging over the whole course of the last decade and a half that we've started deploying EV charging infrastructure. So this is a transformational investment, and it's incredibly important to get it right. Now, that's just the infrastructure law. That's the stuff that we're working on implementation of now. It's even bigger if you look at the Build Back Better Act that Vernice mentioned, which goes big on transportation. It would be, the version that passed the House had $555 billion for climate, easily the biggest investment we will ever have made. And a good chunk of that is for clean transportation, including electric vehicles, clean trucks, and many more programs. I'm happy to talk about the elements in there in the discussion if there's elements that people want to focus on, but I think I've yacked enough about those, and I want to get into, okay, how do we make these investments get real at the local level? Because we need to acknowledge that it's tough to bridge the gap between a big federal program, as ambitious as it may be, and actually accomplishing the things that my co-panelists and I care about here, which is let's learn from local communities. Let's deploy infrastructure that meets the need of a community specifically, not in a general way, but that actually learns from the people who know that community best. So this administration is deeply committed to good partnerships with communities and figuring out how to make that happen at the federal level. It comes down to program design, like actually coming up with a program that's accessible to communities and that learns from them, bringing federal resources to bear for community engagement. So it's not just like a generic program with no link back to the community, but actually making sure there are staff working in federal agencies and in support of federal agencies that get to know the communities that their grants are in and that they're working with, and learn about how to continue to improve those programs. And then just building engagement into the culture. And we've done several things early in the administration to try to make sure that we do that I'll mention as a wrap up, since I know I'm getting close to my 10 minutes. So one example of where we're trying to do this is a new office that was created by the law that's a joint office between the Department of Transportation, which is going to be moving a lot of these electric vehicle charging funds, and the Department of Energy, which has decades of experience on modeling where you should put a charger so that it works well with the utility, on working with communities through their Clean Cities program, and through other programs to really try to understand the specific needs of an organization like a school district or a city. We're going to try to bring those two pieces together and make sure that we have the expertise on call for a state that's never run an EV charging program, or for a metropolitan planning organization that's never so much as deployed a charger, or for a school district that's never seen an electric school bus but is excited to get them out there, or for a transit agency that's ready to start to begin that shift. And we think that expertise and that commitment to local engagement will be a first of kind collaboration opportunity between agencies. Excuse me. So a few other cross-agency activities, and Vernice, you mentioned this, is our Justice 40 commitment. So all of the investments I've mentioned above are part of the administration's overall commitment to making sure that 40% or more of the benefits for these investments go to the communities that have been disadvantaged by pollution burden. We're still developing the guidance. We have interim guidance from a government-wide process. We're using that for execution of our plans now. It lays out some of the key definitions of benefits and how that should be determined, but still leave some of the specifics up for implementation. So we're going to be a little bit developing, building the plane as we fly it on some of the implementation. We're also working with agencies as they develop individual plans for equity and making sure that we're intersecting these investments with their improved work on racial justice and other forms of equality and justice. And building that all into this whole of government approach where the administration top to bottom is working to be more and more committed to partnering with communities and really making our climate work transformatively positive for equity, for justice, and for jobs that matter to people. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't run over too much. I get really excited when I talk about this
Who
stuff,
cares,
and looking
Austin?
forward to the conversation.
You can keep talking because you're talking about money coming from the federal government, flowing down to local, flowing down to community. So you can keep talking if you want to. I'm kidding. Everything you said is something that is really music to our ears. And so I want to encourage people to look at the chat, because the chat is on fire and it's like a graduate level seminar. What's happening in the chat?
So can I ask, Vernice, can I ask you a huge favor, and maybe my co-panelists as well?
Sure.
Because of our
yes,
IT,
we can read the chat to you. Yes.
Yeah, so I can't see the chat. So our IT blocks Zoom chats. If you guys have been saying, Austin, you sound like an idiot, I haven't been seeing it.
No one is saying that. People are just asking a couple things. And so I'm gonna pose a question to Karen and to Kevin to sort of reflect back to Austin, which is, so this money is going to flow down, and I'm going to try to incorporate a lot of what we're hearing in the chat, Austin, in there. What would be the optimum investment scenario for the constituencies that you work with in terms of how to connect this money that's going to flow from the federal government into really having community level impact, municipal level impact, so that there can be butts in those seats, Kevin, to help, because somebody's got to help guide these investments, right? I want you to turn 30, and you may not make it with all the work that's coming from the federal government all landing on your desk, right? So that's a question for them. But here's some of the questions that are in the chat, and I think our panelists can help to respond to them too. The traditional formula for federal transportation funding in some places is 90% roads and highways and bridges and 10% public transit and buses, right? Can we see, and can we look to a 50-50, in at least a 50-50 investment strategy? Others have said, how about 70-75-25? But at a minimum, can we get to 50-50? And how are you going to make sure that these federal dollars can reach communities? That's really, really hard for communities to do, is to be able to tap into that resource, because they usually don't have the infrastructure. They usually can't meet the match. Some local communities, some local towns, small cities, tribal communities can't meet that federal match. How are we going to make sure that the money gets to where it needs to get to? So those are some questions. And then Karen and Kevin, what do you need? What kind of partnership do you need with Kevin and his partners at the administration level to really help meet the needs of these folks? Go ahead, Karen.
I'm going to start by saying the federal dollars flow to the federal government. It's my taxpayer dollars at work. So the conversation about that flow of money should really have a very different perspective on who gets the money. I also am going to say something, Austin, may be controversial, but if all we're doing is replacing gas vehicles with electric vehicles, that's not really getting people out of their cars. We're not going to get people off the roads. We're still going to have problems with gridlock, California, other places, rush hour. The objective should be, I think, to put more people into public transportation, more people on bikes, more people walking, and not such an emphasis on electric vehicles. I have to say, the president looked so happy driving that huge truck the other day. And I'm thinking, why? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or if I'm getting on top of you, Austin. I also think we need to do some things that are really radical in terms of the streets. First of all, our streets are the largest public space in any community. If you took an aerial view, the streets are the biggest public space, not your parks, the streets. And so we need to figure out how to make people claim those streets back for themselves. Let's close I-91 every Sunday. Just close it down to all vehicular traffic and let people walk, ride their bikes, push their wheelchairs, their baby carriages to Hartford and down to New Haven. Or it could be 95 when we go along the shore. We need to have ciclovías where we close the streets, or open streets they're called, where in a route you close the streets to vehicular traffic and let people come out onto car-free streets so that they get to look at their communities differently. They walk across town to the Yale campus, so Yale students go over to Dixwell Avenue. we need to start doing some things that are more radical in terms of how we view our streets. They belong to all of us.
Thank you, Karen. All really good stuff. Kevin and Austin, I hope you're taking notes because we'd like to see some of this pop up in some of your future thinking. Kevin?
So I think a couple of things. One is just what does the city need? In some respects, we're getting that we're very, very lucky, especially New Haven, Connecticut in general, but New Haven because Congresswoman DeLauro and her office are, I mean, the best people in government I know, and the amount of information and help they have given us. Because like I was talking about before, the strain on looking at the infrastructure bill and figuring out what's in it and how much is in it, because a huge amount of Austin was only listing a few things out of a massive, massive bill. And so the question was posed in the chat earlier, how is it going to be, how is that breakdown going to happen between what's going to train, what is going to bus, what have you? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. And that's a question that I've been meaning to ask my members of Congress office. And honestly, Austin's here, so he might know, which will, save me some time. But so there's that side of things where honestly, a part of this is simply for municipal governments to be able to understand, okay, what do we have to work with? The second thing is, and this is with any form of money that's going to cities at least, there's a conflict between this, but it's how to have money that is as flexible as possible, how to make sure that you can use it to actually address those needs and use the information that you have on the local level to be able to make it match up with where you're spending money. The challenge with that is also at the local level, and this goes to community engagement as well, at the local level, so often decisions are informed only by a small subset of the population that usually has a particular perspective. And this is going to go into the next thing that I love to talk about, which is housing. But so often, especially in a place like Connecticut, when you have planning and zoning committee hearings where decisions are being made about where housing is built, what traffic rules are, those decisions are being made by people that can afford to show up at those, people that aren't working multiple jobs, people that aren't struggling to take care of kids at the time, and sometimes there are people that go above and beyond and find a way. It is so limiting sometimes if you're not having a really robust engagement process for decisions to be informed by a very, very small subset of the population that is giving really bad advice around land use, around transportation. And so there's that concern where you don't want to leave it all up to the local level, because oftentimes the local level can really make some bad decisions. But you also want to make sure that the local level is able to inform the way that money can be spent in as effectively as possible to achieve the goals that are set out by the federal and state. The last thing that I'll just mention, and I can talk a lot more about this, but is when we're talking about the conversation on the federal side around transportation, I think so often we are missing, not that this administration is, but so often the conversation is just transportation. And the reality is that housing is one of the most central challenges that we are facing, particularly in a state like Connecticut, where it has some of the most restrictive zoning laws in the country, where the area of the state with the ripest possibility for development almost expressly forbids multifamily housing, which makes more people drive, less people be able to walk, less people able to use public transportation. And that is, and also the prices, that the impact on the cost to residents is enormous in the broader economy. But I'll stop there because I can get into a whole mess of stuff when we talk about housing.
So Austin, do you want to take a crack at some of that, and then I'll go back to the questions in the chat?
Sure. So lots of great stuff in here. So maybe I'll start with Karen's I think excellent points about making sure that we're not getting stuck in this rut of car dependence that we are in, right? So we know we've built this country into a very car dependent country overall. I don't think that's because people love driving so much. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who would like to spend hours a day behind their wheel in traffic, but probably not that many. And so we think about, at least I think about this as improving choices and making sure that people have more viable choices in their communities. And that's why there's significant investments in transit, significant investments in biking. And it does break us out of that classic 80-20 split that we've seen for years and years with only 20% of transit funding. It's, I know, not as much as what advocates would have wanted. That's, we're all subject to the the whims of where the Congress ended up with it, but it does at least break us out of that split and makes a more progressive investment than what we've seen in the
And
past.
also, what do you think that split is in the bill?
I don't have that totted up. That's a good question, and I will try to figure that out. I don't think I have that totted up to hand.
Okay.
But I'm also, Kevin, I'm also hearing your point about wanting to have better sort of understanding and accounting of all the stuff that's in here. I know that's on our to-do list. We have a new head of implementation for this in Mayor Mitch Landrieu, formerly from New Orleans, who really understands programs, really understands communities, and we're all working together very closely to figure out how all these pieces fit together, where we can share infrastructure for implementation, share learning, and I'm sure we'll be providing more outputs now that the bill is law, where we can start to say, okay, here's what's in different pieces of it. We have some high-level fact sheets that are out there, and then with implementation, we'll start to get much more specific. And then the last thing I'll say, I think we do always have this tension between deploying electric vehicles and improving transportation choices for bicycling and walking, and transit. I could say, so in DC, the only vehicle we have in our house is an electric cargo bike. That's how we get our kid to school. And otherwise, we're pretty much just a bus and metro and walk family. But there also isn't time to provide that kind of an option to everybody in the sort of 30 years that we have to solve the climate crisis. And so that's why we're committed to electric vehicles as well. We want to do all the things at the same time. We have to provide better choices and more choices for people who are able to move and find themselves, generally loving not having to be behind the wheel of a car every day. But also, many people are going to either be car dependent or just choose to drive in the meantime. And that's why we need to have this, rapid focus on a shift to electric to at least reduce the pollution burden and the climate impacts of those vehicles as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to integrate a lot of these questions that are in the chat together. We have 25 minutes left, but I want to try and get everybody's perspective on the table. So one really important issue that's being raised in the chat is the role of the metropolitan planning organizations and the role of transportation planning and the infrastructure. And by that, I mean the architecture around transportation planning, the formal process from the feds to the states, to local governments, to these MPOs, to local planning and zoning boards, to state transportation agencies and their local equivalents. There is not a history, there is not a culture of including communities in that process. You have to fight your way into that room, and often only as a spectator. But what we are seeing and what this conversation is about, and certainly what the environmental justice and climate justice and transportation justice advocates are asking for, is not only to rethink the kinds of things we identify as the priorities that we will drive that federal transportation funding to, but the process by which those decisions are made and how we determine what are priorities. What have been priorities in the past have left these gaping holes in terms of who gets services, how modern those services are, how regularly the buses run. Do the buses run on weekends? Do the buses run when people who work at night can use them? And the answer is usually the transit system speaks to the most affluent users of the public transportation system, not the more working class users of the transportation system. So can we design a system that meets the needs of the people who have not been our priorities heretofore? Can we really rethink that? And can we put the MPOs on hold, or at least diminish their power and rise up something that happens at the local level so that local residents can really have some decision-making power in where these dollars are going to go? If you don't think about that, Austin, if you and your colleagues don't think about that, we're going to replicate the same systems that we've had in the past. So people have asked, how about designing streets for people? Actually, that's the next session coming up. Karen asked that, and that is going to be following this session. People have also asked, federal funding and long-range planning go through regional MPOs. They're compelled to do large-scale scenario planning with this funding. How can transit providers and equity and climate policy changes engage better with these MPOs? Have the implementation funnel money bypassing the MPOs? Transportation rules are very technical. Is there support for low-income community engagement allowable as part of the transportation funding, the federal dollars? Are we looking at equitable transit-oriented development anymore? Is that, that used to be a catchphrase about 10 years ago. Are we thinking about transit-oriented development anymore? And at least in Connecticut, that one of the issues, the front door on Main Street to our Metro Hartford office doesn't even open. So you can't get in. The door doesn't even open. So those are just some of the issues that people are dropping into the chat. All three presenters, please weigh in. But Austin, the essential question here is, can we design this system to flow differently? Can we design these dollars to flow differently? And can we prioritize the things that used to be on the bottom and never actually got onto the priority list? Can they be moved to the top? And the things that have always been the priorities, can they be moved to the bottom or for the next rollout? All righty, that's a summary of everything that's sort of in the chat.
Could I actually jump into that before Austin does?
Please,
I
go ahead,
feel
Kevin.
like just from the perspective of somebody working for a local government, it feels like to such a large extent, this current administration has done a lot of that. And certainly it's not perfect, nothing's going to be perfect, but the seismic shift that has taken place between working for the government between 2016 and 2020 and 2021 and now is, in such a short period of time, the paradigm of American politics in the role that government has played, at least for me, has shifted dramatically. And that's not true for everybody, but for a community like New Haven, there is and this isn't just at the federal level, at the state level, and I know that New Haven has the best legislative delegation in the state, but in the next fiscal year, more than double the amount of state funding is coming into the city than it has ever had before. And so at the federal level, these are the largest bills that have ever been passed around transportation. And so I just feel like it's so important that we recognize the role that or this moment in time where we have an administration that really is on our side. And again, it's certainly not perfect, but and I'm sure that the president wanted more things in this infrastructure bill than he was able to get passed through Congress. But I think I just think it's really important for us to see this lens of, okay, we have this one shot, and how great of a job so far, at least from working for the local government, how great it has been to really feel like, okay, finally we have a federal government and a state government that are really talking about these issues in the way that they actually care about talking about equity. They care about making these investments. The governor has been a real leader around transportation, making it a sort of focal point in his administration, despite a huge amount of resistance in the legislature and in for a variety of reasons. But so I just wanted to add that perspective before Austin had to answer how to fix all of the problems in federal government.
Thank you.
Well,
Go ahead, Karen.
I think all of us, it's really good to hear about the flow of my dollars and yours up instead of down. I think we all at the grassroots level need to be really mindful about how we organize in our buildings, our homes, our streets. The street that goes through my neighborhood goes through somebody else's neighborhood, goes through yours, it goes through your neighbors. And so we all have a stake together in organizing. I'll give you an example. With our organization, the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation, we have worked really hard to reach out to less historically served neighborhoods to train people in riding their bicycle. Well, the underreported part of what we're doing is that at advocacy meetings, we're seeing more Blacks and Hispanics show up because they're riding bicycles in ways that are recognized that they ride bicycles. It's not enough, but we certainly hope to do that. We trained over 2 weeks ago 5 Hispanic and Black lead cycling instructors to teach bike education. This is all at the grassroots level. And I want to give a shout out. I'm really glad that Union Station came up. One of the classes we offer on bike commuting is at Union Station. I don't know if you knew that, Kevin. We meet in the bike parking area because it's both a unique location, but it also doesn't cost us anything. So that's 2 reasons. But it also, again, builds that grassroots advocacy. And I'm going to repeat again that we have to do some radical things. It's not up to Austin. This is a shout out on your part, Austin, and President Biden and Vice President Harris. We have to make the changes at the grassroots level. So I also want to mention the ciclovia that Hartford had. Sorry, New Haven didn't beat New Haven to it, or Hartford to it, but it's fantastic that Hartford, and I think it was led by a man named Matt Gale, who put on that ciclovia to close the streets so that people can take back the streets that belong to them. So I think we need to think radically. We need to think at the grassroots level, and we need to always keep in mind to get more people out of their cars.
Thank you. Okay, Austin?
I feel like there's a lot of pressure, but I'm not going to be able to solve all of our problems here today. I think there's really good ideas. I'll just add two things. So one, I think Kevin's point about the opportunity here of just sort of having more resources flowing down, that's going to continue and expand. There would be big benefits from this work just by virtue of moving more resources through the frameworks that already exist, and starved organizations and cities and agencies that have never had the funding to hire, maintain talent, run big projects, think big about things, are now going to have that opportunity in many cases. That said, I think we're also committed to doing better than that. And one of the reasons I'm here in the administration is that I'm just inspired by the principal level leadership that we have. For example, Secretary Buttigieg, who has since day one shown commitment to rethinking how his Department of Transportation works with communities. And that shows up in the entirety of the team that he hired, that I work with on a daily basis. It's a group of people that are deeply committed to top to bottom in each of these programs, making sure that it does a better job of actually connecting to the communities in whatever way that they have available to them. Now, Department of Transportation is often extremely limited in the language of the funding bills that fund their programs and directed to do things a certain way. So it's all going to depend on the specifics of each program, but I can assure everyone that the department right now is in the process of going through every single program and working to figure out how can we implement this in a way that doesn't just, it's not just fiscally responsible, moves the money and accounts for fraud and waste, but is culturally and socially responsible in trying to make sure that it meets all of the goals of the administration for working with communities and improving all of these things at the same time. That said, it's going to take a long time to turn this ship, right? We have gotten very used to doing things a certain way. There's a huge amount of inertia in the system. And I don't think there's any illusion that we're going to get implementation right on year one and then be done. This is something that, my colleagues and I have committed our careers to, right? I don't expect to solve this in my lifetime, even though it's not expected to be quite as long as Kevin's from where we are now, given that I've got a 14-year head start on him. But this is things that they're long, hard problems. And that doesn't mean I don't think we should work on them. It doesn't mean I don't think we can make progress. I think this will be a turning point in our ability to show communities and people what the benefits of this kind of program and spending and infrastructure investment, that this is money that's going to make a difference in their lives. It's going to offer better choices. It's going to offer cleaner air, cleaner communities. But we have a long road. We have a long pathway, a long bike path ahead. If I can change that up for Karen.
So what a great conversation this is. And I'd like to grab another hour for us, but there's another session coming up behind us. So I just want to lift up some other issues that are in the chat. This issue around our planning process and our visioning process for what we want to do is replete with bias. And we really have to work hard to excise that out of the practice, to really drive equity outcomes, right? And to get other voices to the table, as Karen says, we have to do it in our communities, we have to do it neighborhood by neighborhood, but we also have to do it systemically. How do we change that system so that it really lifts up the most voices at the broadest base to help us vision what that planning could be like? I think also when we think about infrastructure, we should think about sidewalks, that people need decent sidewalks to walk on, that people need walking trails, that it's not just roads and trains and buses, it's actually the infrastructure in a neighborhood, which is in such disrepair in so many places and hardly ever gets on anybody's radar screen. Does that count as infrastructure investment? And then we think about transit-oriented development, which I love. I'm from New York City. Our whole city is based around the concept of transit-oriented development. But I now live in the DMV in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And I see as that transit system is expanding, it's also gentrifying and it's transforming the District of Columbia into a city that we hardly recognize. And we don't want that, right? We want people who've suffered and struggled without infrastructure to be there when all the new investment comes. We want them to benefit. And so how do we do that? We have to think intentionally about how we do that. And how we look at housing development as connected to transit development. Also, the concept of e-bikes and e-car share services. There's a great pilot program going on in Trenton, New Jersey, that is, I think, a great model for folks. There's one also happening in Fresno, California. But there's lots of ways to push those e-vehicles out there to serve the needs of people who are not buying Teslas, right? And are not buying the vehicles that are currently on the market. We want everybody to benefit from this e-vehicle revolution. And so how can we do that? And how can we think creatively about it? But we need to think differently about planning, land use planning, transportation planning, regional planning, air quality planning, public health planning, housing planning. All these people need to be in a table together with communities, and they need to move those meetings into communities so they can be dynamic and you can hear from lots of different people and you can meet the needs of folks who have been left out of the process. So I just want to encourage us as this money is going to flow. And Austin, my one great fear is in a desire to move that money as quickly as possible. We're going to climb onto the backs of old systems and old systems thinking and ways of doing business and making investment decisions. And if we do that, we're going to replicate all the stuff that got us to where we are in the first place. We need new thinking. And Karen has talked about some of that new thinking that's happened. Kevin has talked about what local government is doing. You all are thinking incredibly creative at the administrative level, but we can't let those old structures keep us from doing new and innovative things. And so I would just say, in that rush, and I feel it, I know you feel it, Austin, you're sitting in the middle of it, in that rush to push the money out the door, let's not push it into what is shovel ready. And we should be asking the question, is it shovel worthy?
Here's something along those lines that I think is a real structural, just somebody, I have really struggled to read all of the comments in the chat, but somebody referenced councils of governments, and I think in the context of making some of this a little more difficult. And here's a really good example of a current form of government in Connecticut that is probably an inhibitor to actually changing things. And that is the councils of governments, for those that don't know or aren't from Connecticut, are the only regional entity of government. And the way that the voting works in a council of government is that each town in the council gets one vote. And so the city of New Haven is in a council of governments where the population of New Haven is more than almost every other town in the district combined. And so a place where it is predominantly Black and brown residents have like 1/10 of the vote in a decision around regional funding as towns surrounding it that are predominantly white. And that is and we, as the city of New Haven, have a really good relationship with the towns around us. We work really well together, and most of the decisions that are made are not controversial. There's not the push and pull. But the idea that a resident in New Haven gets less of a vote than a resident in Woodbridge or West Haven for decisions around where money is spent, it's a fundamental wrong in this state and something that we need to change. Similarly, the fact that zoning codes are so overwhelmingly concentrated at the local level is one of the biggest barriers to having a thoughtful development of what are the needs of the community as a whole in the state of Connecticut, particularly in disadvantaged communities. How do we change that? And most recently, there was a bill in the legislature that was effectively gutted before it was got out of committee that would have changed that and would have required that areas around a fixed transit district were zoned for multifamily housing. And that bill could not get passed. And it was on a bipartisan basis that bill was, among some, a bipartisan basis that bill was ultimately removed any real substantive changes to zoning. And so there are those challenges that we still face. where sometimes it is a problem of hyper-localization, making something way too local in a part of the state, in a state that's very, very segregated, making an area wholly responsible for the development in that area, preventing any smart development around transportation. And then there's the other side of, on a regional level, we have a system to try to prevent and to try to disempower communities that are urban areas. And that is still law today. And so that's just one of the things, Bernice, to your point, of things that we need to change to be able to administer government better.
Thank you. Well, Kevin, I'm going to let that be your summary comment. Karen, can you give us 2 minutes of summary comment? And then Austin, I'm going to ask you to take us out. You're on mute, Karen.
So thank you. My summary comment is get on your bike, get out your car, push that wheelchair, that baby stroller, get on your walker, your scooter. We want to see wheels and feet on every street. That's it.
Wheels and feet on every street.
Wheels and feet on every street, and close 91 every Sunday.
All right. Austin.
No, I mean, I think this optimism here is really helpful. It's really inspiring. I think we, working in transportation, especially on the kind of like big intractable problems, it's easy to get frustrated or feel like it's impossible. I don't think it is. I think it's very possible. I think we're going to make a lot of progress here in the next couple of years. And I believe that because I believe in people. And it's, you know, while it's people that have made some of the challenging and poor decisions that have brought us to where we are, it's people making good and kind and inspired decisions that is going to, I think, put us back on a better track. And the advantage now is now we actually have some money to put behind that, right? So we can actually fund those good ideas. We can fund those communities. I know money isn't all that it takes to get something done, but Karen, I believe you told us all that if there's no money, there's no mission. So we're going to try to do our part when it comes to that and support both money and mission for all of these important infrastructure needs.
Well, we actually have 5 additional minutes. Any other, there's some links that are in the chat. Don't miss the evening session that is coming right up. Let's see. Folks are having a hard time walking down their main streets in Harvard. EV micromobility for e-bikes. This is a really important point. Only 1 of 239 EV incentives in Connecticut went to low-income households in Connecticut, 1 in 239. And a recent snapshot from Connecticut cheaper EV rebate program, they've been proposing an e-bike rebate pilot project, and but Connecticut, the Connecticut State Environmental and Energy Agency actively campaigned against it. So we all got to get on the same page, right? At the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, at the community level, we got to get on the same page. And in order to do that, we got to be in rooms together to identify what our vision is and how we meet the needs of folks who have been left out of this process before. And so, Austin, maybe there's a need for, for some kind of convening that we could do regionally, that we could do state level, but to help inform how you all are rolling out this money and how we lift up the folks who have been left out of this conversation heretofore. But I have to agree with Kevin. I have been in this field for 36 years, and I have never seen the federal government step up to advance environmental justice and commit to environmental justice the way the Biden-Harris administration is doing. I want to lift you all up and applaud you. I hope you're all healthy when we get finished with this administration, because we're working you like dogs. But we really appreciate what you're doing. We appreciate what you're bringing to the table. And knowing that you ride public transit, Austin, and that you and your family are really in this with us, makes all the difference in terms of what kind of decisions get made and how you do your job. So on behalf of the Center for Latino Progress, I want to thank everybody for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversation. And we could also do a convening regionally, right? There could be a Northeast convening, a Mid-Atlantic convening. But the thing is, we need a vision. Without a vision, the people will perish. And I'm not sure that we have a vision. We have needs, but are we clear on what our vision is? And I think that's where we are right now. And Karen, you've given us so many wonderful ideas about how to really center that vision making at the most local neighborhood level. So we actually still have 3 minutes, and I'm just talking to
Wait,
try and eat up time.
Vernice, let me put in a plug then, because there's two elements of the Build Back Better Act that you just reminded me of. One is for what we have first ever federal e-bike credit, tax credit, which would, I think, bring this in. I mean, I can say firsthand. I'll see if I can get it to focus on this. But this is our little family e-bike with our. It's not really doing great.
Pull it back just a little bit.
Okay, let's try it. It wants to focus on my face instead. Nope. This is our little family e-bike in the back, and I could say making these sorts of transportation modes more affordable to people, because e-bikes are still not cheap, would be really transformative for people and for a way to get the family around. And then it also includes a used electric vehicle credit in the Build Back Better Act, which would be, again, a first ever federal policy, and I think a good way to make sure that EVs are accessible to lower income households. When we look at the data on cycles of poverty, one of the factors that keeps coming up over and over again is an unexpected car repair. If somebody has a job that their car depended on getting to, they can't pay for a repair, you lose your job, that becomes a cycle of poverty. EVs have lower maintenance costs, lower fueling costs, they're going to be more reliable, and getting those kinds of electric vehicles into households, I think, is going to be transformative in terms of saving people a lot of money. So just two more elements, not in the Infrastructure Act, but hopefully what's coming up next.
Thank you so very much. And Thomas, I think it needs to come back to you, but thank you everyone who participated in this really dynamic roundtable. Karen, Kevin, Austin, thank you so very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a Transport Rifle Ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work for us if interested. We hope to see you around.